The building was quiet in the evenings, the kind of quiet that almost hummed with its own life. The marble floors reflected the dim lights, making long shadows that stretched across the hallways. Most people who passed through this place never gave it much thought. They came for rehearsals, for meetings, for the sound of music filling the rooms. They noticed the chandeliers, the polished floors, the grand piano in the main hall. But they rarely noticed the man who walked these halls after everyone else had left. He wore a simple uniform of plain shirt and pants that had seen better days. A janitor, people called him sometimes with a smile, sometimes with a smirk. To most, he was invisible. A figure in the corner, a shadow passing through. People joked quietly about him when they thought no one was listening. They did not know his story. They did not know the life he had once lived before he had become the janitor. Every evening, he followed the same routine. He pushed a mop cart down the long corridors, carefully avoiding the polished floors that could show the slightest streak. He dusted the railings, cleaned the bathrooms, and sometimes paused to rearrange chairs that had been left haphazardly. But it was the music rooms that called to him. He lingered there longer than anyone would expect. He would wipe the keys of the piano, making sure no fingerprints were left, and then step back to listen. The notes of practice sessions, the laughter of students, the occasional frustrated sigh of a teacher, it all felt like a language he could still understand. Even if no one had noticed him in years, no one knew that this man had once spent hours in rooms like this. But as a student, and later as a performer, the piano had been his life before life had asked for more than he could give. Responsibility, loss, circumstances beyond his control, they had pushed him out of the spotlight and into the shadows. And yet the music never left him. It lived in his hands, in the careful way he touched the keys when no one was watching. In the quiet hum of melodies he hummed as he worked. On this particular evening, the building was emptier than usual. The last rehearsal had ended an hour ago, leaving only the echoes of music behind. He pushed his mop cart slowly, pausing to listen as a distant note from the main hall seemed to hang in the air longer than it should. The sound made him pause mid-step. For a moment, he just stood there, letting the memory wash over him. He remembered sitting at a piano once, in a packed hall, playing a piece that had taken months of practice. He remembered the applause, the nods of approval, the way people had looked at him not as a janitor or a shadow, but as someone who could make something beautiful happen. But that was years ago. Now, he was unseen. Some nights he wondered if people even noticed that he existed. He had learned to blend into the background, to move without being observed, to work quietly and go unnoticed. And yet there was a spark inside him that refused to die. The music still called. The piano was still there, waiting, patient. Forgiving, he pushed open the door to the main hall, careful not to let the hinges squeak too loudly. The grand piano sat under the spotlight, gleaming in the dim evening light. Dusting it had become almost a ritual. He ran his hand over the keys, feeling the smooth surface beneath his fingertips. His heart remembered what his mind sometimes tried to forget. Each key held a memory, a note of joy, of struggle, of passion. The room smelled faintly of polish and old wood, a smell that brought him comfort. As he worked, he heard voices outside the hall. A few latecomers were still lingering, talking quietly in the hallway. He straightened his uniform and moved to the corner, pretending to be just a passerby. They didn't see him. He had learned to become part of the furniture, part of the scenery, part of the building itself. And yet he felt the same familiar thrill, the tug of possibility, the hope that maybe tonight something different might happen. He remembered the first time he had come to this building as a young man, full of ambition. He had walked the same halls, but with a different purpose. He had dreamed of playing for an audience that would hear not just the notes, but the story behind them. Life had been kinder then, simpler. Music had been a friend, a companion, a way to express everything he could not say in words. Now, after years of being unseen, he moved through the halls almost as a ghost. People mocked him sometimes, calling him clumsy, calling him slow, calling him a janitor in a tone that made him feel smaller than he was. He never responded. There was a quiet dignity in ignoring their words, in letting the work speak for itself. But inside, the music kept him alive, kept him whole. He reached the piano again and crouched slightly to polish the pedals, each motion careful and deliberate. The polish gleamed under the light, and for a moment he allowed himself to imagine someone walking in and hearing him play. Just for a moment. The thought made his chest tighten, made his fingers itch with the need to touch the keys in a different way. To bring the music alive rather than just cleaning the instrument, he straightened up and stood behind the piano, placing his hands on the keys. No sound came yet. He just let his hands hover, feeling the coolness of the ivory beneath his fingers. He remembered the pieces he had played so many times, the ones that had once made people stop and listen. They were there, waiting inside him like old friends who never left. Outside, the hallways remained quiet. The few remaining staff had begun to leave. The last cleaning cart rattled down a far corridor. And still he stood there, hands resting on the piano, listening to the silence. It was heavy, almost tangible, but it was also full of possibility. Possibility that tonight, perhaps something unexpected could happen. Possibility that someone might finally see not the uniform, not the mop, not the man they thought they knew, but the person he truly was. He thought of all the nights he had spent alone with music, of all the hours he had poured into practice, of all the dreams he had tucked away for later. The piano in front of him seemed to pulse with the promise of those dreams. He closed his eyes briefly, letting a memory guide his fingers. A simple note, soft and deliberate, filled the hall. It was quiet at first, barely audible, but it felt like a small heartbeat in the vast emptiness. The sound startled him. He had not meant to play yet, had only meant to imagine it. But the piano responded to him as if it remembered every touch, every story, every emotion he had ever poured into it. And in that moment, he realized something important. He was still here. He still had the music. He still had the power to create something beautiful. Even if no one had noticed him for years, for a long time, he stayed there, letting the notes linger in the air. It was enough for now. The building, the hall, the piano, they were witnesses to his presence. They had seen him struggle, they had seen him work in silence, and they had waited patiently. And now, for the first time in a long time, he felt the old thrill, the old excitement, the old fear and hope all wrapped together in one simple truth. He could still play. And one day, perhaps someone would listen. He finally set the cloth down, straightened his back, and moved toward the door. The night was coming to an end. The hall would soon be empty. But he did not leave with the heaviness he usually felt. Instead, he walked with a quiet energy, a small smile playing on his lips. Something was stirring, a feeling that tonight might be different. That maybe the music that had been waiting all these years could finally find its way to the world outside this quiet hall. And as he locked the door behind him and walked down the final hallway toward the exit, he felt it, the invisible spark of hope, the reminder that even those who are mocked, overlooked or underestimated have their own power. And sometimes, the world simply has to wait for the right moment to see it. The next day, the building was buzzing with activity. Music students hurried through the hallways, carrying sheet music, their shoes tapping quickly on the polished floors. Teachers moved from one room to another, talking in low voices about upcoming performances, practice schedules, and small mistakes that needed correcting. In the middle of all this, the janitor moved quietly, doing his work unnoticed as usual. He carried his mop cart with steady hands, occasionally pausing to sweep a spot that had been missed or to straighten a chair left crooked. People glanced at him occasionally, sometimes with a faint smile, sometimes with a little chuckle. "There he is again," someone whispered. Another person muttered something under their breath, laughing quietly. He heard it, of course, but he did not react. Years of experience had taught him to let it slide. Words from strangers, words from people who did not know him, could not touch the part of him that belonged to music. That part was untouchable, safe, and private. That afternoon, a small delay occurred in the main hall. One of the performers had been stuck in traffic. Another had misplaced a sheet of music. The event was supposed to start soon, and the director was pacing back and forth, clearly stressed. People whispered among themselves, anxious about what would happen if the performance began late. The hall was filling up with guests. Some were parents, some were donors, and some were curious visitors who had heard that this would be a special evening. The janitor was finishing his rounds when he noticed the main hall was unusually empty. The piano sat there, polished and gleaming, waiting. He felt the familiar tug in his chest, the quiet call of the instrument, the way it seemed to breathe under the soft light. He paused, letting his hands hover over the keys for a moment. The memory of playing, of standing before a crowd that had once applauded him, surged forward. He had not played in public for years, not since life had taken him away from the stage. And yet, here it was, waiting. He hesitated. People might see him. They might laugh, assuming he had no right, that it would be a joke. But the pull was too strong. Just a few notes, he thought. Nothing serious. Just something simple to feel the music again. His hands rested lightly on the keys. A quiet, careful note sounded. It filled the empty hall softly, like a whisper meant only for him. Outside, the director noticed the sound and frowned. "Who is that?" someone asked. A few other staff peeked through the door. "Is he joking?" whispered another voice. Some people laughed quietly, thinking this was a harmless distraction. No one expected what was about to happen. He closed his eyes and let his fingers remember what they had once known. The first simple tune grew slowly, each note deliberate, each movement controlled. It was not loud, not showy, but it had a strange weight to it. Something about it made the hall seem to pause. The chatter of the people waiting outside softened. Some guests leaned forward slightly, unsure if they had heard correctly. The janitor did not care about the audience. He could not. He was no longer playing to impress anyone. He was playing because he had to. Because the music lived inside him and demanded expression. He remembered every late night he had spent practicing, every moment he had spent dreaming of a time when he could perform for others, every small triumph and failure that had shaped him. It all came back now, flowing through his hands as if the years had never passed. The laughter and whispers outside the hall gradually faded. People stopped moving, stopped talking, stopped checking their phones. Something in the music held them in place, a kind of invisible grip that no one could ignore. Even the director, who had been frowning moments ago, paused at the door listening. His eyes widened slightly, the frown giving way to a flicker of curiosity. A few students who had been running down the hallway slowed their steps. One leaned against the wall, unsure of what to do, unsure if this was allowed, unsure if they should be watching, but the sound drew them in. It was not just music, it was emotion. It was a story told without words, a life condensed into sound. And somehow, everyone in the hall, and everyone just outside, could feel it. He played slowly at first, testing his strength, testing the connection he still had with the piano. Then the notes grew stronger, richer, more confident. He could feel the energy shift in the room. The mocking thoughts of yesterday, the laughter that had followed him for years, melted away. For the first time in a long time, he did not feel small. He felt seen not by words, not by glances, but by the resonance of his own music. A guest at the back of the room. A woman who had been talking quietly on her phone stopped mid-sentence. Her eyes widened, and she lowered her phone, staring at the source of the sound. A few others turned around, searching for the player. Some gasped softly when they realized it was the janitor, the quiet man who had seemed invisible all these years. The realization spread quickly through the room, like a ripple across water. He played on, unaware of the reaction. His eyes were closed, his mind in another place. The music told his story. It spoke of lost opportunities, of struggles no one could see, of dreams tucked away in the corners of life. Every note carried a piece of him, every chord a memory. And slowly, the audience, both in the hall and just outside, began to understand. A few students, the ones who had once whispered jokes about him, stood frozen. Their mouths opened slightly, but no words came. They had not expected this. No one had expected this. The janitor, the man they had overlooked, the man they had laughed at, was telling a story they could feel, but could not fully describe. The piano became a voice for him, a voice that had been silenced too long. As he continued, he became aware of the soft applause that began to ripple through the hall. It was hesitant at first, polite and careful, but it grew stronger, louder, more confident. The director stepped closer, nodding slowly, unable to hide his amazement. Guests shifted in their seats, some wiping tears from their eyes, some smiling in disbelief. The hall had transformed. What had been an ordinary evening, what had been a small delay in a performance, had become something extraordinary. The janitor's hands moved with precision, with memory, with a grace that seemed impossible for someone who had been pushed aside for so long. He did not look up. He did not need to. The music was enough. The audience could see it, feel it, understand it in ways that words could never capture. He was no longer a janitor in their eyes. He was a musician, a storyteller, a man who had carried a lifetime of emotion and experience into a few simple notes. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. He played the final note, holding it just long enough for it to linger in the air before fading into silence. The room was still for a heartbeat, as if no one wanted to break the spell. Then slowly, applause erupted. Not the polite, ceremonial kind of applause, but applause that came from the heart. People stood, some cheering quietly, some clapping loudly, some wiping tears from their eyes. The sound filled the hall, bouncing off the walls, surrounding the janitor, lifting him up in a way that no words ever could. He finally opened his eyes and looked around. The surprise, the admiration, the quiet awe on everyone's faces made him pause. For a moment, he forgot to move. He had played for himself, for the music, not for recognition. And yet, recognition came. The laughter and mockery of yesterday had disappeared, replaced by something entirely different. People saw him now, truly saw him, not as a janitor, not as a background figure, but as a human being capable of creating something breathtaking. A teacher stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly. That was incredible, she said. Another guest nodded, tears in their eyes. I never expected. They could not finish. Words failed them because the music had said more than they could describe. The janitor nodded politely, small, humble smile on his face. He did not speak much. He never did. He let the music do the talking. But inside, a warmth spread through him. A feeling that perhaps, finally, the world was beginning to notice what he had carried silently all these years. From that moment on, the evening changed. People approached him, hesitant at first, then more confidently, asking questions, complimenting him, wanting to know more. The mockery, the jokes, the whispers, they no longer mattered. They had been replaced by understanding, by awe, by respect earned not by words but by action. And as he returned to his work after the applause died down, pushing his mop cart quietly down the hallway, he carried something new with him. He carried the knowledge that even in the shadows, even when overlooked, even when mocked, there was a chance to be seen, to be heard, to touch the hearts of others. All it took was the courage to play, to step forward, and to trust that the music inside him would find its way. That night, he went home with a quiet joy. He did not boast. He did not brag. He simply sat at his small piano at home and played again, letting the notes remind him of what he had always known. Talent and passion cannot be hidden forever. Sometimes all it takes is a single moment for the world to stop, listen, and understand, and for the janitor. That moment had finally come. After the applause faded, the hall seemed to hum with a quiet energy that lingered long after the guests had moved on. The janitor sat back in his small office for a moment, leaning against the wall, catching his breath. He could still feel the vibrations of the piano under his fingers, the echo of the notes in his chest. He had played as if no one was watching, and yet everyone had seen him. That feeling was strange, almost foreign, but not unpleasant. It made him aware of something he had almost forgotten, the power of music to speak. When words could not, as he cleaned the remaining areas of the hall, he found himself thinking back to the years before he had become a janitor. Music had once been everything. He had woken up early to practice, spent hours at the piano perfecting pieces, and dreamed of performing on grand stages in front of hundreds of people. Life had been difficult even then, but music had made the difficulties lighter, bearable. Every note he played had carried hope. Every chord had carried a piece of his soul. But life, as it often does, had a way of shifting paths unexpectedly. A family crisis, money troubles, and responsibilities that could not be ignored had forced him away from performing publicly. The piano had remained tucked in a corner of his life, but the audience had vanished. Over time, people began to see him only as the janitor, the quiet man sweeping floors and pushing a mop cart. The world did not know that inside him, a symphony was waiting. That evening, the experience of being heard again stirred something he had thought long dead. It was not just pride or relief or joy. It was memory of a life once vibrant and full of music. Each note he had played earlier had been a small window into that past. And now, as he moved through the empty hall, finishing up the work left undone, he felt a mixture of nostalgia and anticipation. He realized that for the first time in years he was not just remembering the past, he was living it again. Even if only briefly. When he reached the main hall to put away some supplies, he paused near the piano. The polished wood gleamed softly in the fading light, and for a moment, he allowed himself to imagine a different life, a life where he had never left the stage, where every day had begun and ended with the touch of the keys. He thought of the audience, the applause, the feeling of connection that had once been so natural and now felt almost magical. The memory of those early years came back in flashes. He remembered a teacher who had pushed him harder than anyone else, who had believed in his talent when he had barely believed in himself. He remembered the competitions he had entered, the small victories, the losses that had stung, and the moments of recognition that had made every hour of practice worthwhile. Music had been more than a skill. It had been a lifeline, a language through which he could express what he could not speak aloud. Yet life had demanded that he put those dreams aside. Responsibilities had taken precedence, and music had been pushed to the background. He had taken the job of janitor because it was steady work, something he could do to support himself. The uniform, the mop, the floors, these had become his world. And still, in the quiet moments, he had always returned to the piano. Always let his fingers remember what they had once known that evening. After the guests had left and the hall had emptied, he finally allowed himself to play freely. No schedule, no audience, no expectations. Just him and the piano as it had been for years. He played slowly at first, letting his fingers reacquaint themselves with the keys. And then the music grew stronger, flowing more naturally. It was not a performance. It was a conversation, a release, a recollection of every moment he had poured into his craft. As the music filled the hall, mind wandered back to moments he had long buried. The early morning practices, the late nights spent memorizing difficult pieces, the sacrifices made to pursue a dream. Every note carried a memory, a feeling, a fragment of a life that had once been full of promise. And with each note the hall seemed to respond, the walls echoing the sound as if remembering it too. He paused for a moment and reflected on the irony. He had spent so many years unseen, underestimated, mocked even, and yet the music had always been there, waiting. The piano had never judged him, never demanded more than he could give. It had been patient, faithful, and forgiving. And now, in this quiet evening, he realized that it was never too late. The music could still be shared, still be heard, still touch lives. As he played, the memories of his past life grew more vivid. He remembered the first time he had performed in front of a large audience. The nervousness in his stomach, the excitement in his chest. He remembered the applause, the pride, the way the music had made him feel larger than life. Those feelings had not vanished. They had simply been hidden, tucked away in the quiet spaces of his heart. Now, they were returning, filling him with a sense of purpose he had thought lost. He continued to play, moving through pieces that had once been favorites, improvising melodies that reflected his current emotions. Each chord carried a story, each rhythm a memory. He could feel the joy, the pain, the longing, and the hope, all interwoven in the music. It was as if he were telling the story of his life, not with words, but with the language he had always known best. Time seemed to blur. Hours passed unnoticed as he moved through one piece after another. The world outside the hall no longer mattered. The music was enough, and it demanded his full attention. He lost himself in the rhythm, the harmony, the sheer act of creation. In those moments, he was not a janitor, not a shadow, not an unseen figure. He was a musician, alive in every sense of the word. When he finally stopped, the silence that followed was almost overwhelming. The echo of the last notes lingered in the air, carrying with it the weight of his memories and emotions. He leaned back, letting the piano keys rest under his hands, and allowed himself to simply breathe. The room felt different now, as if it had absorbed some of the music, some of the life he had poured into it. He thought about what might happen next. Would anyone notice the depth of what he had played? Would they understand the story behind the music? Perhaps not. Perhaps it would remain a private moment, a bridge between him and the instrument that had always been faithful. And yet he did not feel disappointed. He had reminded himself of what mattered most, that the music lived within him, and that it could always be expressed, even if only in fleeting moments. He thought about the audience from the previous evening. The surprise, the awe, the sudden recognition, it had been overwhelming, almost surreal. People had seen him differently, not just as a janitor, but as a human being capable of creation and beauty. That moment had been rare, precious, and yet it had changed something inside him. He realized that the world's perception was not as important as the truth he carried within, as he packed up his supplies and prepared to leave. He allowed himself a small smile. The path ahead was uncertain, as it always had been. The audience, the recognition, the opportunities, they might come again, or they might not. But he knew now that it did not matter. What mattered was that he had reclaimed a part of himself that had been waiting for years, and that part would never be silenced again. Walking through the empty hallways, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. Life had been harsh, demanding, and unpredictable. But even in the shadows, even in moments of mockery and dismissal, he had carried something vital with him. Talent, passion, and perseverance do not vanish simply because circumstances change. They remain, waiting for the right moment to shine. That night, as he locked the doors and walked out into the quiet streets, he felt a sense of calm. The music would continue whether anyone else heard it or not. He had rediscovered the connection that had sustained him through hardship, and it would carry him forward. He knew that challenges would come, as they always did, but he was ready to face them with the quiet confidence of someone who had remembered who they truly were. The janitor walked home slowly, savoring the cool night air, the faint sounds of the city in the distance, the feeling of possibility that hung around him like a gentle current. He thought about the future, not with fear or anxiety, but with curiosity and hope. Perhaps there would be more moments like this. Moments where he could share his music, moments where the world would pause to listen. Perhaps not. But he no longer needed to wait for recognition. The music was his, and that was enough. At home, he sat at his small piano, letting the day's experiences flow through his fingers. He played not for applause, not for attention, but for himself and for the music that had never left him. Each note was a reminder of the past, a celebration of the present, and a promise for the future. He felt alive in a way he had not for years, fully present in the sound and the moment. In the act of creating, and as the night deepened and the music filled the quiet room, he understood something profound. Life might have cast him in the role of janitor, invisible to most, underestimated by many. But the truth of who he was, the depth of his talent, the richness of his experience, could not be hidden forever. The music had always been there, waiting patiently, and now finally, it had found its voice once more, for the first time in a long time. He felt the kind of peace that comes from reclaiming a lost part of oneself. He had faced the shadows, endured the silence, and stepped back into the light, even if only for a moment. And he knew with quiet certainty that this was just the beginning. The story was far from over. The music would continue, and so would he, carrying the lessons of the past, the strength of his perseverance, and the unshakable knowledge that talent and passion can never truly be hidden. The evening of the next performance arrived with an energy that seemed almost electric. The hall was filled with people more than ever before. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh flowers, a scent that somehow added to the sense of expectation. Guests whispered in low voices, exchanging guesses about what the program might hold. No one knew that tonight something extraordinary was about to happen. The janitor arrived early, as he always did, pushing his cart slowly through the hallways, his uniform crisp but simple. No one paid him much attention. Some glanced at him with a faint smile, others ignored him completely. But inside him, something had shifted. The events of the previous evening, the unexpected applause, the recognition had given him a quiet confidence. He was still the same man performing his duties, but the music inside him felt ready, waiting to break free. As the performers took their places and the audience settled, a small moment of chaos appeared. One of the musicians had forgotten a piece of sheet music, and the tension among the staff rose immediately. The director frowned, muttering under their breath, clearly frustrated. People in the audience began to murmur quietly, sensing that something was off. It was in that tense pause, that tiny crack in the schedule, that the janitor saw an opening. He walked slowly toward the piano in the center of the hall. Some staff members noticed and whispered among themselves, unsure what to make of it. "Is he going to?" one asked, trailing off. Others laughed softly, assuming it was some kind of joke. The janitor did not care. He had learned long ago that mockery could not touch the part of him that belonged to music. His hands hovered over the keys, feeling the smooth surface beneath his fingers. The air around him seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something it could not yet name. The first note came, soft and deliberate. It barely filled the room at first, but it carried a weight that made people stop. Conversations faded into silence. Even the director, who had been pacing impatiently, froze at the door. Guests turned toward the source of the sound, curiosity and surprise etched on their faces. The janitor's hands moved carefully, almost as if he were remembering a language he had not spoken in years. Each note carried emotion, each chord a story. The music was not loud, not showy, but it was impossible to ignore. The audience felt it in their chests, a vibration that was more than sound. It spoke of longing, of loss, of hope, of joy. It told a story without words, a story that seemed to echo experiences everyone had felt, but could not articulate. Slowly, the hall grew quieter, the tension melting into something else entirely. People leaned forward in their seats, unable to tear their eyes away from the man who had once been invisible to them. He played with a depth that came from experience. From years of living in shadows while carrying music inside him, he did not look up. He did not seek approval. His focus was entirely on the sound, on the rhythm, on the story he wanted to tell. The room transformed under his hands. It was as if the walls themselves had become listeners. The chandeliers reflecting the emotion in every note. A few students, the ones who had once whispered jokes about him, now sat frozen. Their faces betrayed a mixture of shock, admiration, and disbelief. They had thought him ordinary, invisible, a background figure in the hall. Now, they realized that their assumptions had been wrong. The janitor, the quiet man who had moved through the hallways unnoticed for years, was telling a story with his music that was impossible to ignore. The director stepped closer. Unable to contain a mixture of awe and curiosity, the frown that had dominated their face all evening softened. They could feel the room changing, the audience changing, the entire atmosphere shifting because of the sound that had emerged so unexpectedly. People who had been tense moments ago were now sitting upright, attentive, moved. A few had tears in their eyes. They could not explain it, could not describe it, but they were feeling something extraordinary. The janitor continued, letting his hands glide across the keys with ease. The notes moved from soft whispers to richer, fuller tones, filling every corner of the hall. Every chord carried layers of emotion, sadness that was tinged with hope, joy that was tempered with longing. The music seemed alive, almost breathing, and everyone listening could sense it. The audience became a part of the performance, even without speaking. They were caught in a shared experience, united by the story the janitor was telling through the piano. Outside the main hall, few staff members had gathered quietly, watching through the open doors. They were stunned. They had laughed earlier, thinking this was a joke, a harmless distraction. But now, they were witnessing something profound. The man they had overlooked for years was commanding the room in a way that no one had expected. It was not just skill, it was presence. It was soul. It was truth. As the music continued, the janitor's mind drifted back to his past, to the memories that had shaped him. He remembered the first time he had sat at a piano alone, feeling the keys under his fingers and realizing that he could make something beautiful happen. He remembered the hours of practice, the discipline, the moments of frustration, the small victories. All of it had led him to this moment where the world could finally hear the depth of what he had carried. Quietly for so long, some guests began to whisper quietly to one another, trying to describe what they were feeling. Words failed them, though. They could sense the emotion, the story, the life behind each note, but no combination of sentences could capture it fully. And that was the power of what they were witnessing. Music had become a bridge between human experiences, a way to connect with someone whose life they had never known. The janitor moved from one section of the piano to another, playing passages that were tender, then passages that were bold, shifting effortlessly between emotion and technique. The room responded. People leaned in, silent but captivated. Some held their hands over their hearts. Others closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them. It was a collective experience, a moment of shared humanity, and everyone present felt it deeply. For the first time in years, the janitor felt entirely free. The years of being unseen, of being mocked, of moving through life quietly and unnoticed, seemed to fall away with each note. He was not just playing music, he was telling a story, claiming space, asserting the value of what had been overlooked. Every note was a statement, a message to the world that talent and passion cannot remain hidden forever. The music reached a crescendo, the room vibrating with the intensity of sound and emotion. It was a moment of release, of climax, where the audience could no longer remain passive. The tension that had built quietly over the past minutes erupted into a shared recognition of the beauty and depth of the performance. People gasped softly, tears rolled down cheeks, and a few quietly murmured words of admiration. And then, as the final chord resonated and faded into silence, the hall held its breath. The weight of what had just occurred lingered in the air. No one moved. No one spoke. They could not. The silence was powerful, almost sacred, carrying the echo of the life and emotion that had been poured into the music. It was a moment suspended in time, a moment where judgment, mockery, and assumption no longer mattered. Slowly, applause began. At first, hesitant, polite, almost shy. Then it grew louder, stronger, more confident. It was not just a response to skill, it was recognition, respect, admiration for the courage, the story, and the humanity of the man who had played. The janitor stood quietly, nodding his head slightly, acknowledging the applause without pride, without showiness. He did not need to. The room had already spoken, and its message was clear. The audience began to approach him. Guests, performers, students, teachers, they came forward one by one, offering words of gratitude, awe, and encouragement. Some could barely speak. Some simply nodded, eyes shining with emotion. The janitor smiled softly, humbled but not surprised. He had always known that the music carried the truth of his story. And now the world was finally listening. Even the director, who had been skeptical at first, stepped forward with a rare smile. I did not expect that, they admitted. That was incredible. Truly incredible. Others nodded, repeating similar sentiments, each trying to articulate the impact of what they had experienced. Words seemed insufficient, but the feeling was universal. Everyone present understood in some way that they had witnessed something remarkable. The janitor returned to his duties after the crowd had calmed, quietly pushing his cart, but something had changed. The hall felt different. The audience felt different. Even he felt different. He was no longer invisible, no longer just a shadow moving through the corridors. He had been seen, truly seen, in a way that transcended uniforms, jobs, or appearances. The music had revealed him, and in doing so, had transformed the room entirely that night. As he walked home through the quiet streets, he replayed the evening in his mind. He thought about the way people had reacted, the way the hall had felt, the way the music had connected with the audience. He realized something profound. Moments of truth, moments of honesty and courage, have a power that no amount of mockery, oversight, or judgment can diminish. The music had spoken for him, and the room had listened. For the first time in a long time, he felt a quiet satisfaction that was deeper than pride. It was the knowledge that he had reclaimed a part of himself, a part that had been hidden, underestimated, and ignored. He had reminded himself and the world that the essence of a person is not defined by outward appearances or temporary roles, but by the passion, skill, and humanity that lies within. And as the city lights flickered around him, casting long shadows on the pavement, he smiled softly. The music had changed the room, and perhaps in some small way, it had begun to change the people in it too. The janitor knew that life would continue with its routines, challenges, and uncertainties. But he also knew that he had found a way to step out of the shadows to be heard, and to touch hearts in ways that words alone could never achieve. The morning after the remarkable performance arrived quietly. The city outside was alive with its usual noise, but inside the janitor's mind, everything felt different. He woke slowly, the memory of the previous evening still fresh, vivid, and almost surreal. The applause, the faces of the audience, the way the room had seemed to hold its breath during his music, it all played over in his mind, not like a memory of what had happened, but as if it were still happening now. He sat at his small piano at home, stretching his fingers over the keys. The music had always been there, but last night had changed something inside him. It was not fame or recognition that stirred him. It was the feeling that he had reclaimed something that had been lost for years. Something real, something essential. He played softly, letting the notes carry the echoes of the emotions that had filled the hall. Each sound reminded him that the courage to share what he loved had created a ripple far beyond what he had imagined. Arriving at the building that day, he noticed subtle changes. Staff who had barely acknowledged him before now greeted him with quiet smiles, a nod, a respectful glance. Students paused in the hallways, whispering in small groups, casting glances toward him. Some looked shy, unsure whether it was proper to talk to him, yet their expressions were filled with admiration. Even the director, who had once seemed stern and impatient, offered a small smile as he passed. The janitor felt no pride, only a gentle warmth. The world had shifted slightly, and in that shift, he had found his place, as he began his usual work, cleaning, polishing, and organizing. He thought about how little people often see the depths of others. He had been mocked, underestimated, and overlooked for years. People had assumed they knew him by his uniform, by the simple tasks he performed every day. But beneath the surface, a life of experience, talent, and passion had been quietly waiting. The performance had revealed a truth that could not be ignored. The music had spoken louder than any words ever could. Throughout the day, students and teachers approached him cautiously, unsure how to respond. One teacher asked, almost in a whisper, if he would consider performing again at an upcoming event. Another student, with wide eyes, said simply, "I never knew. I never realized," and trailed off. Their words were shy, unsure, yet they carried awe and respect. Each encounter reminded him that perceptions could change in an instant when someone reveals their true self. Later that afternoon, he returned to the main hall to continue his work. The piano, polished and gleaming, seemed to welcome him, almost aware that it had been a part of something extraordinary. As he wiped the keys and arranged the benches, he thought about the countless hours he had spent alone with this instrument. Each key held memories, practice, frustration, and triumph. Now the piano also held the memory of a night when something unseen had become visible, when something overlooked had been recognized. A few guests from the previous night returned, quietly walking through the hall. They lingered by the piano, hesitant to intrude, yet drawn by the echo of the performance they had witnessed. Some whispered to one another, recalling the way the music had made them feel. the emotions they had experienced but could not fully explain. One guest, a middle-aged man who had been skeptical at first, quietly said, "I have never heard anything like that in my life. It changed something in me." The janitor, polishing the petals, simply nodded, letting the words settle without needing to respond.